All right, so welcome again to Zoom into Archaeology. I'm thrilled today to welcome Rebecca or Becky O'Sullivan from FPAN's West Central region and Eric Prendergast from CARDO. Thank you both, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks. I'm just going to hit the share screen, see how that goes. Does that look good? Everyone can see? Okay. So thank you so much, Nicole, for having us. Like you said, my name is Becky O'Sullivan. I'm a public archaeologist at the West Central office of FPAN. And Eric, do you want to introduce yourself again too?
Yeah, I'm Eric Prendergast, and I'm a senior archaeologist and principal investigator with CARDO, which is just a cultural resources management firm. And I'm based in Tampa, Florida, just like Becky.
So what we're going to talk about today in our presentation is a project that CARDO has been leading down here in Tampa, and we at the West Central office of FPAN have been very fortunate to be involved in as well, at Zion Cemetery, which was one of Tampa's earliest Black cemeteries. So we're going to be talking about the history of the cemetery, how it was erased over time, and then how it's now been rediscovered. And we will be talking, obviously, about cemeteries and death and burial. We do not have any pictures that show human remains, although we do have some pictures that show objects that were included with burials, but we don't have any pictures that depict actual human remains, just so everyone knows. So we'll get started. Anything else you want to add to that, Eric?
No.
Okay. So some of you might have heard of Zion Cemetery before. It's been a story that's been in the news for the past couple of years. It's been a really big story here in the Tampa Bay area where Eric and I are located. And you know, that's for a good reason. Like I said, Zion is an early African-American cemetery that was here in the city of Tampa, and at one point was erased. It was literally wiped off the map. And so what you can see in this picture here, on the right-hand side, we have a historic map, a Sanborn fire insurance map, and anyone who's done, you know, some historical research on, you know, your old house or the town that you live in, Sanborn maps provide a wealth of information about what cities look like in the past and how they changed over time. And so the original maps, they would be these huge, big, actual paper books. Now they're scanned and you can find them on the internet. But there are these, you know, paper maps that show all the structures that were in one spot at a given time. And so what we can see here is the area that once had Zion Cemetery. But this is from the 1950s, so we see some other structures that are on there now, and we'll get into that more. But one thing with these Sanborn maps is when they were updated, they wouldn't send all new maps. They would send paper cutouts, and then the librarian or the archivist would have to cut out those updates and literally paste them on top of the old maps, so that the old map was underneath and the new update was on top. And this is very relevant for what we're going to talk about with Zion today, because while for many different reasons, Zion was erased from the landscape of Tampa in the past, and these other structures and landscapes were kind of pasted on top of that, the cemetery still remains beneath the surface. And that's what, you know, the work that CARDO has been doing, the work that we've been assisting with, has shown that while we have these other layers that are pasted on top, the history of Zion and the actual physical place itself still remains beneath the surface, just like with these old maps. So with that, we'll start off and we'll kind of dive right into the story of what happened there. So for those of you who are not familiar where it's located, Zion Cemetery is located in Tampa, Florida, in the central Gulf Coast of Florida, right on Tampa Bay. In this map here, you can see here's downtown Tampa, and about 2 miles north of that on Florida Avenue is where Zion Cemetery is located. It's up here in red. So the whole story of how Zion Cemetery was relocated begins with a man who's a cemetery historian and a researcher, a local Tampa guy, Ray Reed. And he did a lot of research on another cemetery in Tampa, which actually was a pauper cemetery. It was called the Cemetery for All People. So he had been interested in this other cemetery for a long time. And so he literally went through every death record, every death certificate for people buried in the city of Tampa in the early 1900s. And he was looking for records for this all people cemetery. What he started to find were death certificates for people buried at this cemetery called Zion Cemetery. The thing was that no cemetery named Zion existed in Tampa that he had ever heard of before. And when he asked other people, they had also never heard of this cemetery called Zion Cemetery in the city of Tampa. So here you can see one of the death certificates here with Zion Cemetery written on it. So what is this place? Where is it? What happened to it? Through a series of kind of serendipitous events, Ray was in contact with a reporter from the Tampa Bay Times, Paul Guzzo, who you can see on the left. And Paul was interviewing Ray for a different story, but Ray, said to him, this story is great, but the real story is Zion. Where is Zion Cemetery? And so at first, Paul was a little bit reticent about it. All he had was, a couple death certificates from Ray. Nobody had ever heard of this place before. How could there be a cemetery that nobody had ever heard of before? So he kind of wanted to stay away from the story. But his partner, James Borchuk, who you can see on the right here, convinced him to dig a little bit deeper and to look into it more to see what he can find. And thankfully he did, because his reporting and his work is what has really brought all of this to light and started this archaeological project to find Zion Cemetery. So one of the first things that Paul found, he reached out to the Tampa Bay History Center, which has an amazing collection of maps, not just for the city of Tampa, but all throughout Florida. You can search them online. They're all, a lot of them are digitized now. So definitely check that out if you get a chance to. But Rodney Kite Powell at the History Center found the original plat for Zion Cemetery. And so what the map shows, you can see it here. It was filed in February of 1901. There are 98 family plots. You can see these little squares here. They're each 20 by 20 feet in size. There's also a potter's field that's up on the northeast side of the cemetery. And the cemetery covers approximately 2.5 acres. Also, it includes a legal description to show where the cemetery is located. So great, Paul finds this map. He's got some, death certificates, but where, does this map actually sit on the landscape of Tampa? So Paul reached out to the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research, and they recommended that he get in touch with our FPAN Center in Tampa to help with some of the research and some of the questions that he had. So, got this crazy email from Paul saying, where is this cemetery? Have you ever heard of Zion Cemetery before? And one of the first things that we did was to look at the old maps and to try to figure out where the cemetery could have been located. So going off that legal description, when we overlay the that original plat for the cemetery in the location that is described you can see the modern aerial that's in the background. No cemetery is located there as far as it appears on the surface. And so this raised lots more questions for Paul. Was there ever really a cemetery there? Were graves moved? What happened to this place? How did it end up looking like it does today when there's supposed to be a cemetery that was there in the past?
And furthermore, the landscape of ownership and parceling has changed since Zion was erased, such that the footprint of Zion today falls under 3 different ownerships. The east third or 2/3 or so of the cemetery belongs to the Tampa Housing Authority. Of course, that is part of the Robles Park Village housing development. The west portion belongs to Richard Gonsmart. That is the Columbia Restaurant family of they're famous. If you're from Tampa, it's like they're sort of like a small royal family. Like they have, or like nobles or something. They have a great deal of power and sway. And the other portion of the cemetery is owned by a small wrecking company that uses it to store vehicles and things like that. And then, of course, you'll see that there are streets. Those are city streets. Those belong to Tampa. So Tampa actually has ownership of this cemetery, whether it's here or not. Now, the reason that this has changed so much is because you're looking at a development that's been superimposed on top of a previous neighborhood. And that neighborhood itself is very important to the history of Zion. That was the Robles Pond neighborhood. So when they named the housing development Robles Park, it's a play off of Robles Pond, but Robles Pond was originally what was here. And you'll see in that blue rectangle to the top left of the screen, that was a Black neighborhood with businesses and, of course, residences, schools. Down in the lower right, we have a picture of the actual schoolhouse from the Robles Pond neighborhood. They had multiple churches, and basically they were there before Zion was founded, while Zion was founded, and then after Zion was erased, all the way up until the Housing Authority seized the property and created their housing development by eminent domain, which we'll get into a little bit more later.
So, like I said, Zion Cemetery is one of Tampa's oldest all-Black cemeteries. The actual oldest public burying ground in the city of Tampa is Oaklawn Cemetery, and that was established prior to the Civil War. And so Oaklawn actually has, it is internally segregated, but both white and Black people were buried in Oaklawn Cemetery. As we move forward in time in the city of Tampa and many other cities, throughout the South, we see this shift to really rigid segregation of all aspects of life for white and Black people. And that extends even to the grave, even to the places where people are buried. And so this segregation was legally formalized in 1896 with the Supreme Court decision in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, which codified into law the separation and the segregation of people based on their race. So into this kind of background, and understanding this, when we're talking about the history of Zion Cemetery, in 1894, so 2 years before Plessy, Richard Dobie, He was a prominent Black businessman. He was also a property developer. He had developed several Black neighborhoods, including one that was known as Dobyville, which is in South Tampa. So in 1894, he purchased the 2.5 acres that would become Zion Cemetery from Isaac Warner, who was a white homesteader and property owner in that area. So he bought the land for $140 to establish this cemetery. So this Robles Pond neighborhood already existed in this area where he bought the property for the cemetery. Mr. Doby was associated with one of the Black churches that was in that area. And so, he probably, he wanted to establish this cemetery to serve the growing Black population of Robles Pond and also, the city of Tampa as well. Because Oaklawn Cemetery, it was already full. There was no place to bury more people. And the other cemeteries that were established by the city of Tampa only served the white population. So there was not a place for Black people to bury their dead in the city of Tampa, that was provided by the city itself at this time. So, like I said, Mr. Doby, he bought the property in 1894. In 1901, the cemetery is platted out. That was the map I showed you before. Almost from the very beginning of this cemetery being established, there were attempts to take the property from Mr. Doby and the other Black ownership of the cemetery. One, really glaring example of this is in 1912, there was a lawsuit that was brought by J.J. Head, who was a former Confederate soldier. He was also the tax collector for Hillsborough County. And one of the things that Mr. Head did was he went around, he's the tax collector for the county, but what he also did was to go around and buy up the delinquent tax deeds on properties that were within the county. So Mr. Head claimed that the Zion Cemetery property was behind in its taxes, even though cemetery properties do not, accrue taxes. So he attempted to buy up the tax deed on the Zion Cemetery property. And in 1912, he actually took his case to court to try to take the cemetery away from the Black community there and the Black ownership. So at first, he was awarded the cemetery because the judge said that he had never heard that there was a cemetery in that spot, which is almost impossible to believe because the judge lived only like a mile or so away from where this cemetery was located. But it does appear that, that ruling was overturned at some point because the cemetery continued in existence, and J.J. Head, we haven't found any documents to say that he actually gained ownership of the property. But after that point and going into the 1920s, we see from the historical documents and maps some changes in how Zion Cemetery looks over time. So in the map on the top, it's from 1916. And you can see the footprint of the cemetery is the same as we saw on the original plat. But as we move forward in time into the 1920s, that front half of the cemetery drops off the map. This is the part that is fronting on Florida Avenue here. And the cemetery, we only see this back portion mentioned as being a cemetery. You can see that a little bit better on this 1922 Sanborn map. So this square here is marked off as a cemetery. We can see that on either side of it, we have two Black churches that are next to the cemetery and obviously, would have been affiliated with the cemetery, burying people here. But this portion here on the front that fronts Florida Avenue is kind of set off as a separate parcel and is not marked as being a cemetery anymore. So part of this, in 1923, this area was annexed and became part of the city of Tampa. And that probably plays into some of these changes that we start to see in the next couple of years after the early 1920s. So by 1931, Zion is completely erased from the map. And this is definitely due to the fact that in 1926, so a few years before this map was made, a man named H.P. Kennedy, who was a white businessman and property developer, bought the land that was Zion Cemetery for $1 from one of the heirs of the original homesteader who owned the property. So we don't know how that happened, but we do know that H.P. Kennedy bought this property in 1926. A few years later, in 1929, he applied to the city of Tampa, the city council, to have his back taxes on the property written off because he said it was a cemetery, so he shouldn't have to pay taxes on it. Several months after that, after he applied for his tax abatement, he applied for a building permit. And a few months after that, in 1929, these buildings here, this storefront, was built on top of the cemetery. And this building still exists to this day, right here fronting on Florida Avenue. And this is the turning point when we see this property go from a cemetery where people, buried their loved ones, to being erased and to being kind of covered over in this other landscape of development.
Yeah, and so as Becky said, after it was erased, that neighborhood continued to operate there. And part of the cemetery was used strangely as a poultry farm, a very small but commercial chicken operation. And there people were living in these houses. In this map, you can see the moment before the land acquisitions started for the building of Robles Park Village housing. So after World War II, Tampa started urban renewal, like many cities in the country, and that involved a lot of times seizing whole areas of neighborhood by eminent domain and building, housing and urban development, federally funded housing. And this was one of those cases. They selected several places in Tampa. Robles Park Village would become the third housing, housing complex in the city. And of course, they viewed it as a viable place because they called it a slum. And, it was the fifth in the city. Anyways, but the community fought back against it. Eventually, the NAACP at the time went to the federal office and brought a case against the housing authority, but they couldn't really stop them. And at that point, the housing authority became more aggressive, and they just started taking parcels. So during the construction, I think we'll see here in the next slide, they actually found under one of the buildings at the corner of Morgan and Ruth Street, 3 coffins. These were little, you can see them, they're the little baby kind. They, look, when you find a little violin case in a cemetery, you know that it's a child. And they called the police, and the police came. That's when this photograph captures that moment as the police arrive on the scene. And they went to the city, and the city clerk at the time went through some records, and he gave back the response that the cemetery's been moved. Whoever purchased it in the mid-20s moved all the bodies. There's no cemetery here anymore. What you're finding must just be some outliers that were missed. So then we actually have meeting minutes from the time and the housing authorities meetings that they were having, where they bring up the subject of the cemetery, and they bring up the quote from the city, and they dismiss it out of hand. They say, it doesn't matter, there's no cemetery here, let's just keep building. So this, importantly, was to be an all-white housing development. It was to be segregated and exclude Black residents. And the buildings are just the same as they were now. There were, 70 years on from their construction. And the only difference is, of course, we've gone through civil rights, and now they're predominantly Black occupied. So now we have this very kind of poignant situation where there is mostly Black community living in buildings that were intended to exclude them, built on top of stolen African-American graves.
Right. And so, all of this, Paul was, researching as he's writing this story. And then we've also subsequently found out a lot more information, since the story has come out. And so with all this, in mind, in June of 2019, Paul publishes his article about Zion Cemetery. It makes the front page of the Tampa Bay Times. And, talking to Paul about it, he said it's probably the most nervous he's ever been before one of his stories came out because of the implications of it. What does it mean if this cemetery is still here and it's under, the Robles Park Village housing and these other properties? What's going to happen? What are going to be the implications of this story? And, it is probably one of the most read stories in the Tampa Bay Times, definitely for 2019. So it made a huge impact in the community, and people are talking about, this story. So another person who, when the story came out was, who came forward. Paul publishes the article. And so one of the great kind of results of that is that a woman, Eunice Massey, who you can see here, she's 96 years old. She actually grew up in a house that's just to the south of where Zion Cemetery was located. So she contacted Paul, and she said that she remembered as a girl growing up there in the 1930s, the cemetery. And she said she remembered what happened to it. She said that she remembered one day in the 1930s when she was living there that a team of men with heavy equipment came and they started digging up burials, digging up coffins of people that were buried in this field that was behind her house. And she said that it wasn't done in a very careful or respectful way, that some of the graves were left open over the weekend or when the workers left for the night, that kids were running around in the field finding teeth and skulls and pulling up things from the graves. And so it was really a jarring kind of story to hear. And so Paul wrote another article about what she had to say. And so then the thinking is like, okay, well, does that mean was the whole cemetery moved? Were all the graves moved? And if so, where were they moved to? Because there's no cemetery in Tampa has an area where there are people that were moved from Zion. So what could have happened? So you can see where Mrs. Massey's childhood home was located, right here on the south side of the cemetery.
That's where Paul, I guess that's the last main event that Paul, that happened before he actually brought the story to the landowners. And if you recall from that slide, the landowners were the Gonsmart family on one side, the Tampa Housing and Family Authority on another side. They are sort of a family, and a small portion that was owned by a wrecking company in the north. So the Tampa Housing Authority took immediate initiative luckily, and you have some understanding of what the historic organization was from what I told you about those minutes that record how they sort of callously responded to human remains being found. The organization has completely changed. They are this very responsible sort of. They're motivated by making their communities healthy and happy and doing a good job at it. And they immediately they themselves, these guys up here, Leroy Moore and Jerome Ryans, read those same minutes of their organization from the 50s, and they were appalled, and they wanted to make it right. So they started looking for archaeological firms to deal with the cemetery. And they reached out to us, to CARDO, because we already had standing contracts with them. We were doing environmental work for them. And they were like, can you guys do cemeteries? And we said, yeah, we can do cemeteries, we do them. And we also, FPAN was involved with the city about this at the same time. So we started scheming, and so Jeff and Becky at USF and we at CARDO just decided to become a partnership to do this project. And so that's how we've done everything as an archaeological partnership between FPAN and CARDO. But what was amazing to me, and I think to all of us about the Housing Authority, is the first thing we would recommend to them would be, you need to build a community-based advisory committee to deal with this. You can't just do this with you guys. You're gonna need input and consultation. But we didn't realize that they are more adept at that than anyone can be, because they have so much experience. Every time they build a new housing development, they do a project of scoping and community input. So they built this excellent committee that has leaders from Robles Park Residents Council, the president of the county NAACP, local activists, housing authority caseworkers who need to actually work with people for relocations, members of the housing authority leadership, also city leadership, heads of certain departments with the city. And then of course we have invited members that are like state and local lawmakers who sometimes attend. It's totally open to the media all the time too. So that was how they chose to do it, and it worked out really well. And so once we had that system in place, we started meeting once a month, and we were able to develop a work plan to start doing the work.
Right, and so from the very beginning, the THA leadership, and especially Mr. Ryans, obviously, and Mr. Moore, made it clear that they viewed this as a cemetery and that it would always be a cemetery. And there were plans in future to redevelop and to kind of, rebuild Robles Park Village and the buildings there, because they were so old and, kind of decrepit, but that the area where the cemetery would be set aside, and it would never be, built on or disturbed. So that was, the kind of starting point. Like, we need to, locate where the cemetery is. Are there actual burials that are still located there? Because we still have people that are living in these buildings. The gray that you see here, these are apartment buildings that are within the footprint of the cemetery. So when the story broke, there were families that were still living here. And so they were very afraid and scared, knowing that they were potentially living on top of a cemetery. It's one thing if you live next to a cemetery and you choose that, but to one day open the paper or, go online and see the story that your house is on top of a burial ground, that's, that's very disconcerting at the very least. So the work plan that was developed was, to as quickly as possible figure out, are there burials that are still present? Is the cemetery where we think the cemetery is, and what are the boundaries of that cemetery? So that if we do find potential burials, that the people who are living in those buildings on top of the cemetery can be moved as quickly as possible. So, we came up with a plan to do a ground penetrating radar survey And you can see the areas in yellow were the kind of first areas. And then in orange, we expanded out even, you know, outside of that, just to make 100% sure of where that boundary of the cemetery was, so that we could give some peace of mind to the people who were living in that area. So our FPAN office, we have a GPR. CARDO has, you know, a lot of geophysical equipment. They've got like really fancy GPR, like it's called Stream C, and it's got, you know, you can drag it down the roads and do all kinds of, you know, crazy stuff. So we brought our capabilities together to do the initial Gpr survey. So we went out there, get our bearings, figure out where we're going to set everything up. And then in all of those open areas that are between the buildings, you can see there, you know, these grassy areas in between the buildings, we GPR'd everywhere. And, you know, so we did our GPR survey with our unit. The CARDO folks used their Stream C equipment, and we had overlap in a lot of spots, which was really great because we were able to kind of double confirm what we were seeing in our different kind of survey methods, which gave that extra level of kind of peace of mind and trying to figure out, you know, where the cemetery is located. And, you know, when we process the results, here you can see some of the results from our GPR. There's one of the buildings is right here. We were able to go right up next to the buildings, which was great. All these little white rectangles that you see here, you see they're oriented east-west. They're lined up in rows and very organized. These are all burials that are within the cemetery that the GPR was able to pick up on. And this is at around 140 centimeters beneath the surface of the ground. So with the GPR, we were able to confirm that, yes, it does look like there are potential burials that are still in this area, and that, yes, these burials are within the area that the maps show that Zion Cemetery was in the past and still is today. And so, you know, we GPR'd all these different areas, and all those little red rectangles that you see are the possible burials that we now have confirmed were intact burials. There are some also that are under the roadway, some that go right up to the buildings, but all of them are within the expected footprint of the cemetery.
This is just a model that our utility division that did the GPR on the CARDO side made. They made a three-dimensional, they decided they should make a three-dimensional laser model of the entire housing complex when they were out there, which I didn't even know they were doing. It's like super high tech, way over my head, but they knew that it would create this very compelling image when they were finished, and it was. I think what they're able to do is the blue rectangles here are the results of individual radar anomalies, individual coffin objects that are buried under the ground, and the red rectangles show areas where we confirmed that with two different types of radar. So when someone that owns this property or knows this property can really embody the space or imagine what it's like to embody the space, because it's a sidewalk that they're used to walking on, and they know the relationship between that sidewalk and the coffins that are buried in the landscape. It's very compelling to people, and this image was used a lot during that stage.
So immediately when we had these results and we brought them to THA leadership, they immediately started relocation of the families and the people that were living on top of the cemetery. 28 families were living within the footprint of Zion Cemetery, and they have all long since been relocated to new housing of their choice. So they had a choice to move to another apartment within Robles. They could move to another THA property within the within the city, or they had the choice to take a Section 8 voucher and move to another place of their choosing. And so, you know, this was also a huge undertaking to help the living residents of Robles to get out of this situation. And it's, you know, really a testament to THA and to also the tenant council leadership. You can see Riva and Clark here, who really did a huge amount of work to make sure that the people who were living in Robles were able to move into a better situation and to, you know, to you know, not be afraid anymore about, you know, the place that they were living. THA has also, you know, done a lot of outreach to the community, the other parts of Robles Park Village where people haven't moved. They've done a lot of resident engagement events where, you know, Eric and I and we've been able to go and talk to residents about our findings and some of the history. They've, you know, had other events. There was a rededication ceremony at a local church that had once been affiliated with Zion Cemetery. THA also, you know, they put up a fence around where the cemetery is and then got all these really great banners printed that have the history of the cemetery and also all the names of people who are buried at the cemetery. And so, you know, that's been great to help educate the residents of Robles Park Village about the history of this place and what happened there. Also, you know, as we were working and doing our Gpr survey, we got to talk to a lot of the residents who, you know, were living in the apartments that we were working around and hear their stories. A lot of them, you know, remembered hearing from their parents and grandparents that Robles was built on a cemetery. So the memory of Zion Cemetery wasn't forgotten, even though it was erased from the landscape in the way that it was. And so, you know, what happened to Zion Cemetery, the history of its erasure is a horrible history, but, you know, it's important to recognize. But the place itself and the people who are buried there is an uplifting and a wonderful history. You know, we've found over 700 death records of people who are buried at Zion Cemetery, and each one of them helps tell a little piece of Tampa history that has been erased up until this point. These are Black pioneers who helped make the city of Tampa what it is today. And so, you know, it's important to understand what was done to Zion, but it's also important to understand the really inspiring history of the people who make up Zion Cemetery too. And we hope that moving forward that that their stories are able to come to light so that we can understand, you know, have a fuller understanding of the history of Tampa. So last month, we started doing some ground truthing out there. So Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, basically they finally managed, they were completed the process of moving families. So people were able to find a new place to live. And that was obviously the focus of the project for a long time, was just dealing with the living community there and how are they going to move on from living on top of a cemetery. Once that was finally completed, as Becky said, starting a couple months ago, I think we went June 22nd through July 3rd, we did a 2-week process of ground truthing and verification where we actually dug out there. If maybe we'll go to the map. So the purpose of this is not to disturb graves. That's our primary goal, is to be able to verify that there are graves that exist here without disturbing the human remains that are within them. And we need to apply that to a number of research questions. One, we need to delineate. So you'll see in Operation 2 and Operation 1, those are designed obviously to be right on the edge of the cemetery. We want to find the terminating row of graves and then extend out our excavation to make sure that we're not missing anything with GPR, which happens all the time. People miss utilities with GPR, and certainly they miss coffins. That was a research focus. And another one was, if you go back to 3, or back to the slide, Operation 3 down there, we'll get back to that at the end here, but we also wanted to find out where there were graves that could have been moved. As Miss Massey observed, you see her house represented there as an orange rectangle. We want to archaeologically investigate that area, because when bodies are moved, often they're very disturbed, and there can be human remains eroding in the soil after a removal event. We needed to investigate that for a cemetery management purposes. So Operation 2 up in the Northeast, let's go there. That's where we're standing now in this photograph. And this is how we go about this. We'll remove the surface carefully. This is a really highly skilled machine operator here. It's become a pretty good friend of mine, and he is a surgeon with a steel bucket. And before this started, we had the luxury in this case of spray painting the grave locations on the grass. And having done it without doing that in the past and doing it with the grave spray painted, I like this a lot. It's so much nicer, and everyone knows what you're doing. You know, it brings everyone. So that's what you're looking at. We'll go to the next slide. And that is that same excavation pretty much done. And you can see from this altitude, where this is a drone photograph, the grave, those are grave shafts that Becky just outlined with her pointer. And this is a slam dunk. We can see that the graves end, and we can see that there's a good delineation outside of them. And so I assume everyone can see these. Some of them are more subtle than others, but that is what a grave shaft looks like. And so when you go to dig a grave with a shovel, of course you pull all the soil out and you pile it into your back dirt along the what we call a grave shaft. And then after the coffin goes in, you push all of the soil back in, which, as many of us know on this call from digging, intermixes all of the soil into a different fill. It's a fill that's going to stand out, hopefully, against the surrounding soil. And indeed, this is a pretty visible grave shaft at Zion. And we have started in this photograph the actual process of verifying a coffin. So we're right in the center top of this photograph, beginning that excavation with a test unit.
So just like Eric said, you know, the reason that we opened up such a big area, especially outside of where we thought the graves were located that we had seen with a GPR, is because we wanted to make sure that graves did not extend outside of the cemetery boundaries that we thought. So you can see here, we've opened up 30 feet outside of where the last row of graves are, and we don't see any grave shafts like we do in this area. So that was great, and we were able to really verify and figure out that eastern boundary of the cemetery. And also, like Eric said, we were able to carefully excavate one of the burials down to the top of the coffin to confirm that the coffin was still there and that human remains were there, and the grave had not been moved. So in this project, and from the very beginning, it was decided that no human remains would be removed or disturbed as part of the work that we did with ground truthing. And also any other burial artifacts that we found, we documented in the field lab that CARDO set up, and then those went back into the burial with that individual. So like I said, no human remains were removed or disturbed, and also all the burial objects were put back in with that burial when we covered everything back up. So we were able to confirm with that one burial that you saw there that the coffin was intact. These are the decorative thumb screws that would have been on the top of the coffin to keep the coffin lid down. As you can see, they're, like I said, very decorative, nice coffin hardware. This coffin also had a glass viewing window that was up on the face of the coffin. So this area we thought was the pauper cemetery, but the actual coffin that we found here was actually pretty fancy. It had some nice hardware and that other, burial window feature. So that really changed our idea of who was buried in this particular part of the cemetery. Maybe it wasn't a pauper's cemetery like we think of at all, but, also had burials of, people who had purchased a plot. So that was, interesting finding from that one.
So quickly moving on here to Operation 1 down there, just to get it in your mind where it is in the southeast. I think we have a map of it next, or an artifact. So there was another, we'll skip the ground truthing, the delineation, but there we also confirmed another burial through careful excavation to the top of a coffin. But this is an example of something that we found all over the site. And this is the most exciting thing about the project to us, is that we were finding grave offerings. These are objects that were placed with the deceased by their loved ones, not inside of the coffin or archaeologically, very luckily, on top of the coffin, but instead they're suspended in the grave shaft above the coffin, several, maybe 15 inches above, or in some cases over a foot, maybe a couple of feet. And these follow a really well-known African-American burial custom that's known across our region. And there are certain types of objects. So mostly what we have are fine vases and pitchers that are made of, in this case, a really nice ceramic you're seeing here. This vessel would have had an ornate flower petal rim, and then a lot of them are made of plate glass or pressed glass, and we'll find also vessels, cups, china, and then really adorably with this burial, we found a little teapot that was under even this vase, and it was pewter and it didn't hold its shape. It was really difficult to excavate. But this person was buried with a little teapot, and most importantly, almost all of these offerings have shells. Becky, can you tell us about the shells?
Sure. So if you've ever been to a historic African-American cemetery in the South, especially cemeteries where we have people who come from the Bahamas, also if you've ever been, into the kind of Gullah Geechee, coastal Georgia, North Florida area, cemeteries in that area, African-American cemeteries, you will see shells that are left as offerings on the graves. And this is a tradition that goes back all the way to cultural traditions in West Africa. In some West African traditions around burial, the afterlife is seen as a kind of watery world. And so the shells are a representation of that kind of watery afterlife. And they're also a means that, by leaving these shells on the graves, you're helping your loved one to pass over across the water to the land of the ancestors. So these are objects that were left purposefully and with love and care by, the families of those who were buried at Zion Cemetery, so that their loved one could pass peacefully into the afterlife. And also continue that long tradition, that long cultural tradition that their ancestors before them had also practiced. So when we saw these, when we started seeing these in the grave shafts, it was really exciting and wonderful, because it's, such a wonderful connection to the people who were buried there and their beliefs and their culture.
Last stop, Operation 3. Again, just to quickly remind everyone, the purpose of the Operation 3 excavation was not to confirm intact burials, but to investigate to see if there were the opposite, burials that had been removed. When we first opened up this area, It was pretty scary because it was grossly disturbed, very, very disturbed. Becky and I and everyone are looking at each other while we're excavating in this area, just puzzled and a little scared, because when you're dealing with something that's this turned up and you're not seeing any types of shapes or intact stratigraphy, how are you going to see a coffin until you hit it? So we were nervous, but moving forward to the next slide, we did get down, and you'll see here, we're down very deep. We're down to the depth that we would expect to hit coffins. And this is all of a sudden where a strange signature occurred, which are these very large rectangular features. These did not strike us as normal grave shafts. In fact, to the left of Becky's cursor, you can see some, not really see well, but those are normal grave shafts.
You can see this one here is much smaller.
These ones have a darker color, a more homogeneous fill, are much larger, and had no sign until we were right on top of them. So we thought maybe the workmen that Miss Massey observed in the 1930s dug the whole area down, just as we did here in 2020 in this photograph, and then removed the bodies from that depth and then filled everything back over with fill. So to test that, we installed this test unit. And you see exactly that. I have not seen this before, but this is what we find when someone has, before we get there, taken the body out. And so what the sign of that is a disturbed grave shaft, check, and then total absence of human remains, absence of intact coffin wood, no shape from the coffin. Usually there'd be a coffin stain, not having that stain there. And then what had occurred in this case was the workers had thrown back in the grave offerings. You can see them there. Beautiful, beautiful conch shells, some scallop shells, and some ornate coffin hardware that they also threw back. And only one piece of human bone was left, and it must have been by accident. It was a cut piece of scapula that we found out of context. It was hardly even inside of the feature. It was like on the edge of the feature. So, but this is where it gets very interesting. Our colleague who works with Becky and Jeff out of their office was with us, Ryan Harkey, who is an archaeomalacologist. He studies shells. He's a huge shell nerd. Yeah. And he was freaking out because he was identifying all these shells. And when does the shell guy get to be on a site where the most important things are the shells at a cemetery? Ryan's probably never going to get this again. But Ryan was able to identify real time that this is a queen conch shell, and importantly, was not harvested in Tampa, would not have been harvested in Tampa even historically, because the range of the queen conch, I always say, I'm from Pittsburgh, so I'm not like a coastal person, I'm a Yankee, and I say it wrong. Anyways.
We won't hold it against you, it's okay.
Their range extends only to the very tip of South Florida, but importantly, to the Bahamas. And there's tons of conchs found in the Bahamas, queen conch.
Right, and that's important as well because we know from the death certificates that there are a number of people who are buried at Zion Cemetery who were born in the Bahamas in the West Indies. And there are probably even more people who, even if they weren't born in the Bahamas, that's where their families came from. And so these conch shells, these queen conchs, are a legacy of, you know, that kind of Bahamian influence that we see with Zion Cemetery as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And what's so important about that, Becky and I were talking before that we wanted to highlight, is that these cemeteries, though they are apparently erased, are really spaces of resistance and resilience through because of the time period that they're from. They're coming through post-Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through segregation, and then getting erased somewhere in between segregation and civil rights. So when they existed as segregated Black spaces that were sort of contesting the white supremacist system that they had to carve a space out from. And when you do although it was attempted to erase Zion Cemetery, when you do any amount of archaeology out there, all you find is African American burial tradition. So it's sort of screaming that, you know, like, I am Tampa's Black Cemetery whenever you do any kind of analysis. And so we find that the artifact, this is a space of landscape of resistance, and that the artifacts themselves bear that concept out.
So in the Tampa Bay area, this, you know, Zion Cemetery story has really kicked open the door to find more cemeteries that have been erased in, you know, similar ways, more African American cemeteries that have been erased in similar ways in the Tampa Bay area. So if you were looking at a map of cemeteries that were known in the city of Tampa in, you know, 2018, before the story came out, this is what it would look like. These red blotches that you see here. But since the Zion story has come out, more research has been done in these other Black cemeteries that once existed and still do exist within the city. And now we have many more cemeteries that are back on the landscape. Zion Cemetery, Ridgewood Cemetery, College Hill, Port Tampa. You know, this research has extended across Tampa Bay. There are two Black cemeteries in Clearwater that have since come to light because of community memories and advocacy to find them once again. And also, you know, cemeteries in St. Petersburg as well. So people have always, Black people in the Tampa Bay area and Black people, you know, everywhere in the Southeast, there's still memory of these places. They're not forgotten. But the question is, will we listen to the memories and the stories that people have of these places? And will we take it seriously? And will we do something about it? And Zion Cemetery has kind of opened a door so that there is more belief that these things existed, they still exist, and that we can find them again and kind of put them back on the landscapes of our communities. So I just want to end with a quote from one of our colleagues, Fred Hearns. He's longtime Tampa historian, and he's now starting his PhD at USF in the anthropology department. But I think he really tied it together in terms of the history of Zion and then, you know, what we see going on today. And he said, you know, but you can't hide the truth. It will be dug up. Those young people out in the street inherited our rage. Until we tell the whole truth, there will always be a lingering evil waiting to pop its head up. And so, you know, like I said, these cemeteries, they, you know, show in a very stark way the reality of what Black people have had to deal with in terms of anti-Black racism and white supremacy that has attempted to, you know, erase their communities. But they are also, like Eric said, places of resilience and resistance that are important to understanding the full history of our communities. And if we can put them back on the landscape, put them back in people's memories and, you know, consciousness, then we can start to kind of deal with these legacies and heal these wounds as a community and have a fuller understanding of the history of our community, which is so important. So that's all we got. We want to thank you know, the residents of Robles Park Village, Paul Guzzo and James, Ray Reed, Mr. Moore from the Tampa Housing Authority, and all the others who have made this project so wonderful to work on.
Wow, that was a really compelling presentation. I learned so much, even knowing a little bit about the project myself. Like, I had no idea, you know, all about all those details. So thank you so much, Becky and Eric. That was wonderful. And I think everyone really enjoyed it too. Some people messaged me privately, said they had to leave, but that they really enjoyed it and they're sorry they didn't get to say thank you, but they do say thank you.
Well, we're sorry that we couldn't cram it all in and make it like even shorter.
I wasn't even tempted to check my email during the presentation. For everyone who's still around, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, or you're welcome to turn on your mic and ask questions too.
We got one from Jill here.
Oh yeah.
Curious to know if we found any notable personalities who are buried at Zion.
So there were some people who were prominent pastors of Black churches who were buried in Zion. I think Richard Dobie's son was buried in Zion. There were, I mean, so many different stories of, you know, people who were owned businesses, or, you know, were barbers, dressmakers, who worked on steamships, who, you know, did all sorts of different things. So it was, you know, a lot of diversity in the kind of the people who were buried there, which was really interesting to see so far.
Yeah, one of my favorite ones at the moment is, this just keeps coming up. You know, there's so many connections. When you take 740 potential burials and you start picking it apart and seeing who they're related to, of course, they're related to everyone in the community today. But one really interesting one is Ada T. Payne, the Friends of the Library, that is one of our libraries in Tampa, is kind of having to serve as our Black History Museum. But Ada T. Payne is so important because she was the first Black librarian in Tampa. And she's honored by having this part of the library named after her. And her brother, I believe, is buried at Zion. So that's one. There's got to be a million connections as we move forward. So will the THA remove the buildings? Yes.
Yes.
So, you know, something that we were really remiss here in not saying, the goal is, you're welcome, Jill. The goal is to turn this into a permanent memorial. And the Housing Authority is really behind that. The way they're going to do it is all the landowners are going to donate their lands into a nonprofit. And that nonprofit is going to become the Zion Cemetery Memorial. It's like this dream. Everyone wants to believe in it, but it could, you know, it could go wrong in a lot of ways. It's going to need a lot of money to work properly. But so in part of that plan, and in concert with their redevelopment of Robles Park Village itself as a housing development, THA plans to carefully remove these structures with archaeological assistance.
Yeah, so all the property will be brought back together, and Zion Cemetery will be reconstituted and be a cemetery and a memorial again, which is fantastic.
Becky, here's a question that I think relates to your experience about these 20 by 20 plots from Julie, wondering if they're the same as in white cemeteries. Becky has experience with all kinds of cemeteries in Tampa, particularly.
I think the family plots that are in Oaklawn Cemetery are similar size. So that is pretty similar to ones that we see for contemporaneous historic cemeteries in Tampa.
No, we have not found any grave markers.
Although, yeah, so we didn't find any headstones when we were doing the ground truthing. We do know that there were a very few graves that were moved from Zion before it was erased. And they were moved to another historic Black cemetery in Tampa, which is Memorial Park Cemetery, which was established in 1919. And so those graves, the headstones were moved from Zion and the graves and moved to Memorial Park. So we have an idea of what the headstones look like in Zion. And there were concrete headstones, there were marble headstones. And so that's interesting. But I mean, that's literally only like I think like 9. We haven't found any headstones actually on the Zion property.
It would just be solid gold. I'd love to find some.
I think you guys got all the questions. There was someone who had messaged me privately during the presentation and said that they were really excited to share your presentation with a nonprofit that works with historical cemeteries in Ohio. So they were excited about seeing it go up on YouTube so they could share it. So I just wanted to tell you all that. Oh, we got another question here. No, okay. I thought there was a question there. Okay. Well, is there anything else you guys want to conclude with or close with, or anything you want to say, or programs you want to plug coming up? Or
I would just say that one of the things that I found really inspiring and great about this project is, you know, it's an archaeological project. We're trying to find where the cemetery is, but so many times with these sorts of things, the graves are then removed and moved somewhere else. But, you know, from the beginning with this project, the understanding was that the cemetery this is a cemetery. It was a cemetery, it is a cemetery today, and it's going to stay exactly where it's at. And so I think that that's a really wonderful precedent to set with the other cemeteries that are uncovered in the Tampa Bay area, that these are places that should be preserved in place, and that we need to think very carefully about disturbing these sorts of places because they're so important to communities that are still there today.
Well said.
Yeah, I would hazard, I would make a bet that Tampa isn't the only place where this has happened either.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That's a big takeaway from this. Yeah. Also, the patterns of the way that it happens. You know, at first we were kind of trying to get our heads around this topic, and asking questions to each other and to other researchers like, well, what are the methods that kind of like during segregation people used to take land? And we didn't know if there was going to be any patterns, but now that we're looking at sort of all the Black cemeteries around town that we know of at this time, there are some patterns, you know, and I would love to start to understand how those patterns relate to other cities around the country and stuff, you know.
Publish. You'll have to publish all about this project. I know, you know, other communities would really benefit from this knowledge, especially, you know, stewardship groups or descendant communities in other cities. So, yeah. Well, excellent. Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Eric, so much. That was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you
for everyone else, yeah, of course. Happy to have you. Maybe we'll have you back again sometime soon. For everyone who's still here, we do have 2 more presentations left this month on Thursdays at 3:30, and hopefully I'll be getting September's schedule up soon as well. And you can find all that information on the FPAN website, fpan.us, or we also post everything on our Facebook page as well. So thank you again, Becky and Eric. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you back here next week.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.